Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. We're welcoming back a guest we've had on the program before who is author of the book When Technology Fails. His newest book is When Disaster Strikes. It's a comprehensive guide for emergency planning and crisis survival. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Matthew Stein. Matt, how are you today?
Well, I'm really doing great today. Thanks a lot for having me back on.
Now, this is an interesting book. Tell us about how you came to write this. Are we anticipating some really big things coming on the horizon here?
Well, I think there's no question there's big things coming. The big question is when, how bad, and which big things are going to happen. I mean, between climate change, and I like to call it global weirding, because in the average it's warming, but it changes the whole stability of the weather patterns we've been used to for centuries. So, like this year, I mean, February has felt like late April down here in California with incredibly warm storms and high, at least we're having storms. I mean, we didn't even have any moisture earlier, and at least now we're finally getting it. But it's like 2 months ahead of time. I mean, the weather is like late April, and yet, much of the eastern part of the country is locked in a deep freeze. So you're seeing the stability of weather patterns just gone. And weather's not the only thing. We're seeing financial instabilities, government instabilities. We're going to see more and more riots and government changes when people can't afford food and fuel anymore to keep their houses warm or to keep food on the plate and keep from starving. So we're seeing a world that's reaching a lot of limits that are going to cause huge instabilities in a wide variety of patterns. And so, which disaster you need to be ready for, well, that depends on where you live and the luck of the draw, and where the dice fall.
Now, this isn't just, say, alarmist thinking, isn't this? Is something that's really going to be happening?
Yeah. I mean, I have a Bachelor of Science from MIT, and when I wrote my first book, When Technology Fails, I had kind of received a cosmic download, call it, my homework assignment from above. I received the storyboard outline for this massive book project to help people live more sustainably and more self-reliantly and to cope with coming instabilities in the world. And to be honest with you, I hadn't given those things a whole lot of thought before I received this giant download in meditation. But one of the first things I did after I got this homework assignment, and I still wasn't sure I was capable of taking it on and doing it, was I dove into the best of the scientific writings on the state of the world. What's going on. Before the term peak oil was invented, I started looking at the peak in world oil production, the Hubbard curve, predicted in the 1950s by a major he had a PhD in geotechnology and was a top-notch executive in major oil companies, and he predicted the peak and decline of both first the United States oil and then the world's oil production. And this guy predicted it at a time that the U.S. was the Saudi Arabia of the world. I mean, we exported. It's hard to believe that 50 years ago, America was the Saudi Arabia of the world. We exported more oil to the rest of the world than anybody else. And in 50 years, we went from becoming the number one exporter to the number one importer of oil in the world. We import more oil than anyone else. So China is rapidly catching up with us, and the problem is that China and India are rapidly growing and industrializing, and they have huge populations, many times that of the United States. And together, China and India alone are like 40% of the world's population combined, and they're hungry for oil. I mean, they don't consume nearly the fraction of what we do, but they're growing and they're getting more and more hungry for it. And we're struggling in the world. I mean, the world's major oil companies right now are starting to cut back on their looking for oil. The media is all, we have all this oil, we're fracking, and we're doing horizontal drilling, and everything's great, and America's solved our oil problem. Well, that's a bunch of bull, because they're already complaining that they're spending more money than they've ever spent before developing and getting this oil, and they're seeing diminishing returns. They're spending record amounts of money to get it, and they're not even producing like they produced last year. All that fracking is like a huge money pit, and producing oil short term, but it starts drying up like really, really fast. You just have to keep drill, and the best spots are already being drilled. So we're in a heap of trouble from multiple fronts, and good science and good data indicates that this is just plain so. That we can pretend it's not. We can be like ostriches and put our heads in the sand and say, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. Supply side and economics is going to take care of everything, and we can grow exponentially in our world forever, and nothing's going to collapse and nothing's going to be a problem. Well, the oceans are collapsing. The shellfish in the world are dying now because the acidification in the ocean is raising to the point where record crops of shellfish and scallops are dying because they can't form shells anymore because the acidification of the oceans. I mean, we're seeing the destruction of the rainforest. We're seeing global weather patterns. It's like pick your poison. There's no question doing what we are doing right now will result in the total collapse of the world as we know it. Now, how fast it's going to happen, I don't know. How bad it's going to get? It's going to get bad. How soon? I don't know. Do you need to be ready for things? Yeah. I mean, you don't need to be. You can wait, and pretend that the government is going to deal with these really big deals in nice fashion and take care of everybody and not have to worry. But, I don't think that that's a very wise course of action.
What's really interesting about your books that I really enjoy is that they almost have a Boy Scout approach to how you develop things that you could use that are pretty much, available, within reach. Tell us how you came to come up with some of these things here.
Well, a lot of them are really Boy Scout-like things. My father was actually a scout leader before he had too many kids, and then he became his own scout leader. In other words, he had 5 kids. So by the time I was of the age of Boy Scouts, he stopped being a scout leader and just was just taking his troop of kids fishing and hunting and skiing and backpacking and camping and and canoeing and all of those things. And so I have a background growing up in Vermont, and my parents just loved and were totally happy whenever they were outside. And so that was always great for us kids to be in tow and go with them on their trips outside. And then as a young teenager, I was eclipsing my parents in my ability to ski and climb and hike and stuff, so I started doing more extreme things on my own. And then I have a Bachelor of Science from MIT, and I've always been a hand, and that's in mechanical engineering, and I've been a hands-on kind of guy. Now, even though I'm a bit of a geek, I've cast my own metal and thrown and pit-fired pottery and blown glass and run mills and lathes and machined parts for myself, and so I'm a very hands-on kind of guy. I've also been a carpenter and a contractor, a building contractor, and so in my books, that practical, hands-on craftsman, engineering, backcountry guy, just can't help but come out in my books. I mean, that's me.
Now, I know that what we're seeing a lot of, especially in the last year to 2 years, is very extreme weather, especially in the Midwest and the East Coast, with the snowstorms. I mean, I was actually talking with a lady who was from Michigan, and she was talking about on the lake that normally part of the Great Lakes freeze, but usually the deep shipping lanes don't, but they're actually freezing now. So even the deep shipping lanes, they can't even get through.
Wow.
And, this is pretty incredible stuff to hear, and you think, what happens when the power goes out? Like, living here in Portland, Oregon, we had a little bit of a snowstorm. It lasted a couple of days, but you think to yourself, what does happen? In fact, we actually had a transformer blow, and we have a wood pellet stove, which, everybody thinks is so great, but this dadgum thing is hooked up to electricity.
Right.
So what good does that do you if you don't have electricity? I miss having the wood stove, by the way, but you think to yourself, what can you do when the power goes out with these extreme cold conditions?
Well, one thing that is great to have, I mean, it's only good for short term, not forever.
Right.
But it's to have a small, quiet, like Honda 2 kW, that's 2 kilowatt generator. And, at my home, I have a big job site generator, like a 5 kW, that can run, heavier duty loads. But I never use it, because it's so loud and obnoxious, and it really sucks through the gasoline. It's very expensive if you want to, power your house on it all day. but I have a really quiet, very efficient, very clean. It's not smelly and it's quiet. It doesn't drive me crazy. Little Honda 2KW. People use them camping all the time, and it's nice. I can run things like a fan on a pellet stove, and my refrigerator and my freezer, and a computer and a few lights. Kind of basic stuff. I mean, it's not a lot of power, but it's pretty low cost and pretty easy to run, and it keeps the critical things going in my house when things are down. And then I also have like a travel trailer with a nice large solar panel on it and an inverter, so I have that as backup too. But say you're in a situation where you don't have any power at all and you don't have a backup source, and if you're not in Portland where it doesn't stay that cold for long, but you're in like a place like Minnesota, then after a few hours to a day or two, your inside temperature in your home will gradually equal the outside temperature. And if the outside temperature is 0 degrees, then that means you're going to burst every pipe and every plumbing item in your house that's filled with water is going to burst unless you know what to do about it. And so that's something I go into in fair detail in my book, When Technology Fails, or actually When Disaster Strikes, in the surviving in the cold without heat and power, because it's a real problem for a lot of people in this country. If the combination of severe weather happens to coincide with a long power outage, then you're in trouble unless you know what you can do.
I think what's also interesting, too, that you talk about in your book, and it's so few people really know this, having worked, in types of, I guess, public serving places, is things such as first aid. There are so few people that really know those skills, but those are so very important to have.
Well, they're really important, and I've been an avid outdoorsman for decades. And knowing first aid has been important for my own times that I've messed up and gotten myself hurt, but I've also been able to assist with other people. I helped collect a child's finger that she'd cut off in a playground accident, and I was able to wrap it and then store it on ice and get her to the hospital and have her finger reattached. And I came across a lady in a mountain biking accident with a fractured skull, and it was kind of weird because there was a whole crowd of people around them, and then there was a man and a woman next to him, and I had to encourage them to open the airway because she was going to choke on her blood in her mouth. And the guy who was right there was a doctor, but he was terrified of liability and didn't want to touch her. And she dies because you don't open the airway, then your liability because she might have a spinal injury is, she's going to be dead. So it was kind of weird that there was a nurse and a doctor on the scene and me, and I was the one that had to kind of take charge because that kind of blew my mind in that one. But it's really important in that both When Technology Fails and When Disaster Strikes have a built-in complete first aid manual, because I think it's so important, and it's fully illustrated. In fact, my illustrator was an EMT herself, emergency medical technician, and an incredible artist, and I think her illustrations are better and clearer than the Red Cross manual's illustrations. She did an outstanding job in that chapter.
Mm-hmm. I know that's just kind of one of those things people don't think about, is having a good first aid kit. It's one thing to have a box of Band-Aids, but you really need to go a lot further with that because you really just don't know when you're going to need a lot of those things.
You really don't, and I actually have multiple first aid kits, but I have sort of in my go bag where I kind of keep things around, I have them sort of divided up. I have a backpack with sort of backcountry stuff that's lightweight and compact, and then I have a blue tub, big blue plastic tub, storage tub, and that gets like the bigger, heavier stuff in the storage tubs. So I've got a really big river guide kit that people take when they're guiding people down rivers. People get dumped out in rapids in the Grand Canyon, and they can get banged up really badly. So the river guide kit has stuff you can stitch someone up with if you have to, and air splints, things like that. But when I have to put things on my back, like if I had I live in earthquake country. I live in Reno, Tahoe area, actually Truckee, Tahoe. And one of the big scenarios, potential scenarios here, is a big earthquake. And so I imagine if an earthquake happened in the summer and it took the bridges down in both directions from my house, and the firestorm happened and they couldn't, it was summertime in California, and if everything's going well, it's hard enough to stop these fires, and they often can't. And imagine if there's an earthquake and bridges are down and you can't get fire trucks and things out to places, then I might have to put stuff on my back and go down to the river and cross the river because I couldn't get out in either direction with a car, and a firestorm is approaching. So I have to consider the possibility that, yeah, I'd much rather hook up my trailer and throw a bunch of cool stuff into my trailer in the back of my four-wheel drive truck and head on down the road. But if I can't do that, then I need lightweight, compact stuff I can just put on my backpack and get out of Dodge if I had to. And so I've got my big honkin' first aid kit, and I've got a little compact, fits in the palm of my hand first aid kit that I carry on my back that I supplement with some first aid tape, cloth, 1.5-inch tape, and a couple of ace bandages in this small kit. So, nothing's perfect and fits everything. So sometimes you have 2 or 3 of something in different sizes and variations. So depending on your need, you're set.
Mm-hmm. The other thing, too, that's really important for people to know, I mean, obviously when there's disaster striking or we have a potential, like I remember when Y2K was, all the rage, and I actually talked with the Jeffrey Modick, who was really one of the people responsible for discovering the Y2K thing there, and talked with him about his book, Nothing to Fear. It was really interesting. He wrote this novel-like story, but he was showing this is what we need to pay attention to. It isn't so much the grid going down that's the problem, it's how people react to it.
Well, the grid going down is a huge potential problem.
Right.
Because we all think, it'll never go down on a large scale. But it went down on a pretty big scale for Hurricane Katrina. I mean, you had systemic collapse over a large area. But the fact of the matter is that with solar storms, or which are, the sun acts up and burps a bunch of charged particles that head off in space, and this happens all the time, but on occasion those charged particles end up getting launched towards planet Earth, and they wreak havoc with us. And the fact of the matter is that extreme solar events happen on the average, every 75 to 100 years. It's been 90 years since the last one, and it was 75 years, or 60 years before that, to the one before. So we've had 2 in 150 years, and it's been 90 since the last one. So we're basically due or overdue, and an event like that is guaranteed. If it's as strong as the 1921 one, it's guaranteed to take down the grid for months to years over most of the northern and southern hemispheres of the world, which would be totally devastating, and not like how bad is it they react to it. It's like you'll have no elevators, no refrigeration, no internet, no oil refining, no deliveries of fuel, no pumping of water, no pumping and treatment of sewage. I mean, everything that you can consider modern in our modern world will cease to function except for, some solar and wind things. And the problem is that anything that's hooked to the grid will be so small it won't be able to keep the grid going. And even the nuclear power plants will have to disconnect themselves from the grid and go to emergency shutdown. And if we don't maintain fuel supplies over the many months to years that this is expected to go on, then those nuclear power plants will start melting down Fukushima style within 1 week to 1 month. When they run out of backup fuel to keep the pumps going, they're going to start going off like Fukushima, unless the local people have been able to use their wits with no grid power to unload all of the fuel rods out of them and put them in fuel ponds, and then somehow keep those fuel ponds from boiling dry when they run out of cooling pumps to keep them going. So you're looking at like a huge potential end-of-the-world scenario that's kind of guaranteed to happen, and it's just a matter of rolling the dice. It was like the hurricane the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for 50 years warned that the levees around New Orleans were not adequate to survive the onslaught of a Category 3 or higher hurricane. They said it's a disaster waiting to happen. It's not a question of if, but when. And the solar storm is the same thing. All the scientific modeling says this is a disaster waiting to happen of extreme magnitude, like 1,000 Katrinas hitting at once, and it's not a question of if, but when. And the good news is there's a fix. For roughly the price of a single stealth bomber, we could fix the grid from the worst things happening in the end of the world scenarios. But the bad news is the government's just talking about it, like they talked for 50 years about fixing the levees and never fixed them until it was too late. We're in the same boat here with the solar storm. So this isn't a, and it's inconvenient and the power's out for a few days. This is the government's collapsed, the internet's gone, people are starving everywhere, nuclear power plants are starting to melt down, and there's total chaos and nobody knows what to do and how to deal with it. This is a situation that's 1,000 times worse than Hurricane Katrina, and it's guaranteed to happen, and they're just talking about it. And I mean, it's mind-boggling. When the study was released by Meditech Corporation, which was funded by the funded by the DoD and by Homeland Security, and it was overseen by Oak Ridge National Labs and Sandia National Laboratories, real smart, super PhD, brightest minds in the world kind of guys. And they showed that the solar storm, as strong as 1921, would fry roughly 350 plus of these massive transformers that keep the grid going in the United States, a couple thousand in the world. And you say, well, so what if you lose a transformer and go down the hardware store and buy them? Well, these transformers are custom designed. They're tens of millions of dollars each. They're hundreds of tons each. And there's a 3-year waiting line to get one.
Wow.
And so in 2006, a major solar storm, not nearly as extreme, like 1/10 as strong as the 1921 storm, caused 14 of these transformers to eventually fail in South Africa. And the whole country, the only way they could operate was they had to do rolling blackouts and basically dole out, like imagine trying to work every day when 3 or 4 days of the week, 6-7 hours a day, you have no power.
Right.
No heat to run lights, no elevators, no refrigerators, nothing. And try to get a generator when it's like that, when the whole country wants a generator and there's like 2-year waiting line to get a generator. And so for a whole year, they had to get these transformers on order and rush them. And a year later, they were finally able to get them in and installed. And that's 14 of them. And that's pulling from all around the world. Now imagine 2,000 of them in the world are fried at once. And most of the countries that make these generators are fried too, and they're in chaos too. And how does the world put itself back together at that point? How many years does it take, and what does the world look like when it's back together? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is real. So what happens? In the United States, they have the SHIELD Act in Congress to mandate that industry goes out and implements the safeguards to protect these transformers from either a natural EMP, like a solar storm, or an artificial EMP, like some nasty country, some terrorist group or nasty country like Korea decides that they really want to put it to the United States. And they're already basically in the Stone Age in Korea anyways, so if we did it back to them, they'd survive. But, all they need to do is launch a nuclear weapon above the United States, blow it off at, 5 to 150 miles above the surface of the planet, and bingo, a big chunk of the United States is cooked and electrically and in trouble. Now, the solar storm is, in my opinion, far worse than the EMP, because the solar storm, even though it doesn't destroy nearly the amount of electronics locally, it's such a widespread phenomenon, it takes the grid down. In other words, a solar storm's not going to fry your computer and not going to fry your electronic control systems that run a nuclear power plant. It's not going to fry the things that run the internet, but it's going to collapse the grid on a massive scale, so that and everything else will collapse after because it all relies on the grid. Now the EMP is going to fry a lot more electronics up close. It's a total fallacy that everything electrical is just going to stop working in an EMP. I mean, that's just baloney, because the EMP studies done and cited in the Congressional EMP Commission said that roughly like 15% of the cars driving down the road will stop in an EMP and will be non-functioning, and that most of the cars that are turned off at the time of an EMP will still function. And people say, "Oh, okay, great, my car will function." Well, okay, so your car is functioning. What the EMP will do is it'll fry all those control systems that make our world go down. Pretty much every complex digital control system, anything that's computers are networked together with network cords and lots of wires, like factory control systems that have a sensor here and a little digital controller there and are all connected together with wires, all of those will cook. So, okay, so maybe my iPhone's going to be fine, and maybe my laptop's going to be fine, and my main PC is probably going to cook because it's tied into too much stuff. And so those little electronic gadgets in my house, and maybe my car will run. But try to get gas when there's no refineries working. Try to fix anything when there's no internet working, so you can't even diagnose and figure out what the hell's going on with stuff and fix it. And try to control a nuclear power plant and keep it from melting down when all of your digital control systems and in your eyes, nose, and ears, because you can't exactly walk inside a nuclear reactor and figure out what's happening inside. When all of those things are fried, what are you going to do with that nuclear power plant when all that control systems are fried? If you're lucky, you've got some backup pumps and generators that didn't fry from the EMP that you can get going and manually pump water through there. But 3 Mile Island cooked on a nice sunny day when everything was fine and there was just some weird little control system anomaly and it caused a partial meltdown in 3 Mile Island. And there was no solar storm and there was no EMP, and it was just, some little glitch that somebody didn't notice that caused a partial meltdown. And for 3 days they didn't know if it was going to go totally Chernobyl style or not. They didn't know. And now imagine you have an EMP and all of that really cool stuff you use is just totally fried.
Ugh.
And so we're looking at some like the solar storm's guaranteed to happen. You just don't know when. I mean, it's absolutely guaranteed to happen. I mean, ice core sampling show that these happen. They don't happen like clockwork. But the statistical average is we have a 1 in 8 chance of a crippling solar storm happening every decade. And so 1 in 8 chance, it's been 9 decades since the last one, and it's a 1 in 8 chance for every decade. So do the math. I mean, it's going to happen, and you just don't know when. And the EMP, well, that's dependent on, there's a lot of countries out there that really don't like us. There's a lot of, we have 1 million civilians that died due to our intervention in Iraq alone. Think about, like, if you're have a wedding party in Afghanistan and the little drone thinks that you're nasty people and your whole family and extended family is all wiped out by some drone because some guy watching a video game decided that you look like terrorists and not having a wedding. I mean, there's an awful lot of people who really want to put it to the United States, and the thought that you could get some Arab sheik's oil money and you could buy a little small nuclear device in the black market from the failed state in the Soviet Union and buy yourself a Scud missile for $10 million and buy a little junk freighter and hire some engineering guys and from some school in the Middle East somewhere and who are trained in the United States and set this missile off from the junk freighter on the east coast of the United States and then sink the freighter and bingo, the U.S. is crippled and a half dozen nuclear power plants have gone into Fukushima-like meltdown.
Ooh.
I mean, it's not a very difficult scenario, and it's not guaranteed to happen like the solar storm one, and it's not actually nearly as bad as the solar storm one. And if we're lucky, people are going to wake up and shake our government out of its apathy and tell them to do something. And, I have this article, 400 Chernobyls, and it's posted in its most complete form at my website, whentechfails.com. And when I was researching for this article, I planned on spending a couple of weeks max on it. I spent 8 weeks of no work, just working on the article because and I had a stack 14 inches tall of documents by the time I was done, the most important of which have hot links and a reference directly in my article. And I kept hoping it was going to be better than I thought, and it turned out to be way worse than I thought. And I couldn't stop myself from working on the article until I felt it was complete. I felt it was just so important. And, you know, it was hard for me to, like, basically lose 2 months of income. My wife was furious with me at the time. And so it was, you know, but I felt driven that this was so important that I had to get the information down and let people know, because it's avoidable. And so now what happens? So the government has this SHIELD Act, and they say that they're going to mandate that private industry ponies up the billion or two to fix the problem. So what does private industry do? Well, there's this corporation called NERC, North American Electric Reliability Corporation. Sounds good, like good guys, huh? You know, making sure we're all reliable. Well, NERC is kind of like Fox's Garden, the chicken coop. It's formed of people from private industry about private industry in the utility companies. And so what does NERC do? Well, NERC looks at it, and NERC actually helped fund like some of the initial studying, and then they got called the HILF report, High Impact Low Frequency report, on you know, extreme dangers to grid stability in North America and to the world. But now they come and they look at this and they kind of fire the people who did that, wrote the HILF report, and they publish a report saying, don't worry, everything's okay. We took a look at the data and we decided we have plenty of safeguards in place and the grid's going to be fine, and don't worry. And I believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and the Easter Bunny. And so they published this report. It's kind of like the climate change deniers, like 95% of the climate change deniers are funded by the fossil fuel industry that doesn't want to see their cash cow go down the tube because people are worried about a little, you know, burning fossil fuels and a little climate change. So the same thing happened here. They basically published this bogus report saying everything's okay. And then they said, well, what new data did you come up with? And, you know, what new studies did you do? And what new computer modeling did you do? It's like, oh, we didn't do anything new. We just looked at everything, and we are of the opinion that we're fine, just the way we are. You know, and well, what about those top scientists at Meditech and Oak Ridge Labs and Sandia, you know, and Lawrence Livermore? Well, you know, we don't have the code to the Meditech. We don't have the computer code, the programming code to the Meditech study, so we can't verify it. So we're just going to ignore their results and believe that we've got it covered. And that's where we stand today.
Mm-hmm.
That's the level of protection that Big Brother is giving us in this scenario. Is they're just, you know, like, oh, well, I'm not a scientist, so this North American Electric Liability Corporation sounds like they're really know what they're doing, so I'm going to trust what they say. Well, what about all these other scientists who say the opposite? Well, I just don't want to spend the money, you know. And we'll think about it tomorrow. You know?
Right. Huh.
Scarlett O'Hara.
Well, I think the biggest thing that people can take away from this is that, you know, you can't really rely on somebody else to be sure that you're safe, and that you should be prepared and, you know, and know what you need and what you need to have on hand when things like this possibly can happen. It's always better, you know, to be prepared than to just put it off until it happens. And so many times people do that feeling of being safe, when the fact is if you really paid attention, you know, kind of buy in or, you know, get involved into the idea of a little alarmist thinking so that you can be prepared, because you'll feel a lot more confident and safer if you do something like that.
Yeah, and, you know, the perfect book, really, for being prepared and to be able to open it up in a real situation, say, okay, what do I do now, is When Disaster Strikes. Because that is, people complain when technology fails is like too big for their go bag, and, you know, I never want to carry that on my back. It's like phone book size. And When Disaster Strikes is get the same number of pages, but it's 8.5 by 11. It's a regular size book, not a double size book.
Right.
When Tech Fails is like a double size 8.5 by 11 book. So When Disaster Strikes is much more convenient to keep in your car or in your go bag, and it really in not too paranoid, like end of the world is coming philosophy, just real world stuff walks you through how do you start out and how do you develop a plan and how do you put together a go bag and disaster kit and it walks you through step by step, and you don't need to do it all at once. You just start small, and then you keep adding on and building on it. And of course, if your level of paranoia gets really high, like you can see things getting really bad in the world, then there's a lot of then all of a sudden it's like, okay, let me go the extra mile before Costco's gone and the supermarket shelves are bare, and let's really do what we got to do because I can see the writings on the wall and it's like right around the corner. And I'm not saying it's right around the corner right now. I'm saying I don't know if it's around the corner or not right now. I mean, a solar storm can happen any day with no warning. Just if you go outside and just mind-blowing, the sky's lit up orange and gold streaks. Like in 1921, the sky had purple and green and orange and yellow streaks, and it was lit up from the North Pole to the Dominican Republic to Puerto Rico and to Hawaii, and from the South Pole all the way to American Samoa. So the entire planet was lit up at night for a couple of nights in a row, except for a very narrow, deep tropical sliver right around the equator. The rest of the planet was lit up at night, like amazing. And in 1859, the Carrington event, it was lit up for a week. There was 1-2 punch of two huge CME, coronal mass ejections, launched out of the sun towards the planet Earth, and one hit and revved it up for 2 days, and then just as things were quieting down, a second blast hit the planet and revved it up for the rest of the week. And so it was just amazing. Now, when that happened, well, telegraph stations burned down. In 1921, Penn Central Station burned down from induced currents on the power lines. But there was no massive grid. There were no extra high voltage transformers connecting the grid like they have today. See, today, to minimize power transmission losses, we have these massive transformers that are like 20 feet tall. You have to shut down a freeway to deliver one of these things. And they boost the voltage to 350,000 to 1 million volts. And then they send that super high voltage across these giant power lines, over to another transformer somewhere else, and then they step it down to smaller levels that are usable in the local power grid. And those are the things that fry. So the old-fashioned stuff of 1921, it burned down some telegraph stations and Penn Central Station, but most of that stuff was very robust and could handle a solar storm. It was kind of a neat, trippy phenomena, but no big deal. But nowadays, the modern stuff can't handle it. It's far more efficient than the 1921 style stuff, but it can't handle the pulses from a solar storm, and they're not designed to handle it. But there is a fix. There is a fix. It costs about $1 to $2 billion to put the stuff in to fix it, and there's just nobody ponying up that couple billion. Industry says, "Whoa, that's $2 billion out of our bottom line. No way, we're not going to pay that." And government's saying, "Well, we can bail out the banksters for $500 billion, $1 trillion, but to save the end of the world for $2 billion? No way, we're not going to do that." That's the price. Think we could have a whole new bomber for that much money. I mean, come on. It's like, get your priorities straight.
Really. The book is When Disaster Strikes. Our guest today, Matthew Stein. Matt, is there a website people can find out more?
Sure. I've got a couple websites. There's whentechfails.com, whentechfails.com. That's my information-intensive website with the full 400 Chernobyls article. Like if you scroll down the front page, you'll see like a header and a first paragraph, and then click on Read More. And then my other website is mattstein.com. That's my author's website, MATSTEIN, Matt with one T, Matt Stein with one T. I spell Matthew with two and Matt with one. I would just never conformed well. Even my parents spelled it the other way, but, whatever. I was a stubborn kid, and I'm still stubborn.
Well, that's what helps you beat back the solar storm when that happens.
I guess, yeah. Or helps me, borrow against my house and suck up all the equity in my home and writing When Technology Fails because, a little birdie told me to do it. And so, I guess stubborn people like me get things done sometimes,
Well, I'm also stubborn enough to know that I don't care how convenient your new book is. I'm going to carry around the other one, which I still have. So.
Well, they're both great. One, that the When Disaster Strikes has stuff on solar and EMP that are totally not in the old book, in When Tech Fails. But if the world melted down completely, I'd really want a copy of When Technology Fails, on my bookcase, because that has the old-fashioned technologies. So, if things melt down, I'd much rather fall back to 18th century technologies than caveman days. I mean, think of living like in the 1800s versus the caveman, and I'll pick the 1800s any day. So, they're both really good books. There's some overlap between them, but there's, 2/3 of When Disaster Strikes is new. And When Technology Fails is roughly double the information of When Disaster Strikes in it. So, there's overlap, but they're not the same.
Well, thank you again for being on the program. It's always a pleasure to have you on talking about these things. It keeps people awake, to realize that they need to take the necessary steps to be prepared, and what a pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure, and I like to leave people with my motto, and that's to do your best to change the world and do your best to be ready for the changes in the world. And thanks so much for having me on today.
You bet. Thank you again. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.